Where did the U.S. Army in Vietnam expand their operations in 1967 and 1968? What really happened during the Tet Offensive? And was it a tactical and strategic success or failure for the Army? And how did the Army respond to the My Lai massacre? For these answers and more insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum Enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the United States Army Center of Military History. This is the third episode of a five-part series on the Vietnam War, where we are discussing the Army activities in Vietnam during the pivotal years of 1967 to 1968. Joining me to continue leading us through this discussion is Vietnam War historian Dr. Erik B. Villard. Welcome back, Erik, and thanks for joining me for what I'm sure will be another fascinating discussion.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And just to remind our listeners that Dr. Villard is the digital military historian for the U.S. Army Center of Military History and one of the Army's leading Vietnam War historians. He wrote a volume in one of the U.S. Combat Operations in the Vietnam War series titled Staying the Course, October 1967 to September 1968. That was published in December of 2017, and just coincidentally, that happens to be our topic of discussion today. And he's currently working on the next book in that series, covering October 1968 to December 1969. And outside of CMH, Dr. Villard is the founder of the Vietnam War History Foundation, a non-profit organization that has over 44,000 members on its Facebook group. Very impressive. He also has appeared as a historical advisor and analyst on many documentary projects, including to Ken Burns and Lynn Novick for their Vietnam War documentary series. So, Erik, anything I'm missing that is worthy of note?
Anything Vietnam War is going to have my attention. I've got some projects coming up, some documentaries that will be coming out in the next few years, so keep your eyes peeled. And I've been doing a lot of podcasts, and I got to say, just so great to be able to talk to everyone about the Vietnam War.
Yeah, this is a fascinating subject, and we want to make sure that, we're covering it in as much detail as we can, and that's why we're dedicating 5 episodes to this for our podcast. And I'm sure we'll revisit Vietnam to cover more in-depth information on certain battles or key leaders later on in future podcasts. But now let's transition back to the 1967. So let's set the table for the listeners. Where are we going into 1967?
So going into 1967, the American military presence in South Vietnam, again, is headed, up to and past 400,000. And this is mostly Army, but again, Navy, Air Force, even some Coast Guard, Marines. General William Westmoreland is the overall commander of this force. And so he's been in the job for a few years now. 67 for him is going to be the year where he can really bring American combat power to bear in a big way. This is, as some people have said, the year of taking the offensive, the year that we have enough logistical capacity, enough combat troops to finally really go on the offense and try to push back against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong threat.
So can you describe what was Westmoreland's strategic intentions or his plans?
So being the MACV commander, and again, that means he is not in control of the South Vietnamese government or its military. He's an advisor. His American advisors are helping the South Vietnamese at all echelons, but he has to be respectful of their needs. And so he's there to help build the South Vietnamese. He also has a relationship with some of our allies who are fighting alongside of us. So the South Koreans, for example, have committed by this point about 50,000 troops.
Oh, that's a significant number.
It's a very significant number. Again, we came to South Korea's aid during the Korean War. And this is, part of our new relationship with South Korea. If they're going to help contribute troops. Now, we don't tell the South Koreans what to do, but we basically suggest, and they generally say, all right, that sounds good. So the Australians and New Zealanders have their area of operation. The Thais have sent a brigade. So there are some of our free world allies who are fighting alongside of us. But Westmoreland's big goal for 67 is to really start chewing away at these remote enemy base areas. As I said before, most of the people in South Vietnam live in the lowlands near the coast where you can grow rice. But a lot of the country in the interior, mountains and jungles, are very inhospitable places. That's where the VC and North Vietnamese like to have their secret camps. So Westmoreland, being a smart guy that he is, knows that you can't simply win the war by killing, enough VC or NVA. It's more sophisticated. You have to go after those bases because all the supplies they're getting, or at least most of it, is being carried laboriously down the Ho Chi Minh Trail from North Vietnam. So every time you find a hidden supply cache, you take away that rice, you take away that guns, that makes the enemy less capable. So this is going to be 67, going into these big, forbidding jungle areas throughout the country and really starting to clear them out. That's the big priority.
So what were the big battles that we encountered? I think we had Operation Cedar Falls.
Right. So early on, for example, in the Three Corps area, which is the area around Saigon, north of Saigon, you have some of these, again, really forbidding areas. One of the areas that had always been particularly troublesome, and it's just a few dozen kilometers from Saigon, is a place called the Iron Triangle. It's sort of a diamond or triangle shaped area of jungle that is close enough to the city to pose a real threat. Now, the thing that's really confounding about it is the Viet Cong had spent decades building tunnels beneath this jungle.
Is this Cu Chi?
This is like around, tunnels of Cu Chi and that whole area around the Saigon River. So one of Westmoreland's first priorities is to clear that place out. So Operation December 67, Operation Cedar Falls, sends in American forces from multiple directions to clear this place out. So the Viet Cong, seeing all this tremendous strength, essentially try to hide. And so they go under these tunnels and it's very difficult to find them. So what do the Americans do? A lot of things. They use these big bulldozers called Rome plows to actually scrape away the trees and the jungles and knock those down to create roads and to open landing zones. So they're doing that. They're spraying Agent Orange.
Oh, wow.
Which is herbicide, which is to kill the foliage, so you expose the bunkers that are hidden underneath.
Right.
They're using dogs to try to sniff out the Vietnamese who are hiding underground. And when you do find one of these tunnels, and again, some often very, very hard to find, it was an American volunteer, a soldier, nicknamed Tunnel Rats. Usually a smaller guy, because these are not large tunnels, who would go down there with a 45 or 38 and a flashlight to see what was down there. That took real courage.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Because you know that there's bad guys down there, and as some of these tunnel rats discovered, more than bad guys. In some cases, they had these little tunnel dead ends that would go under water, but there's no way through the other side.
Oh, wow.
Or there's some places where they have snakes or scorpions or spiders or things, So...
And explosives, too.
And explosives, booby traps, if you didn't know the right way. And, of course, Viet Cong down there. And some of these tunnels were so elaborate that they had 3 or 4 levels. They had whole operating facilities, printing presses. So
It looked like little towns, little villages built under
absolutely.
the
And some of these dated back to World War II.
ground. Oh, okay.
So they'd been doing this a long time. So this is one of the Cedar Falls big operations. They never do entirely clear out the Iron Triangle of the tunnels, but they do neutralize some of them. I mean, later on, the Army came up with some very interesting ideas to find these hidden tunnels. My favorite is they used bed bugs and hooked them up to microphones. The idea is bed bugs smell, I guess, your carbon dioxide, but they the proximity of humans, and they start to squeal. So by amplifying their little squeals, the idea is that you stick this little wand of bed bugs out there, and you're looking for the.
That is fascinating.
Yeah, well, that's it. Armies always try and.
I had never heard or read that before. That's
or
incredible.
they use like the Mighty Mite, which is like a big old leaf blower, and so you just pump, tear gas down there or something, So anyway, it was an ongoing problem, but this is what they're doing in early '67, going to some of these really, really.
And how long did
places.
Cedar Falls last?
Cedar Falls, the actual operation lasted, about a month. Now, it was never entirely neutralized. I mean, the enemy still functioned there, but it was certainly less of a problem. And in some cases, what they did was they relocated whole hamlets because Vietnamese who were living there.
Okay, they really located Vietnamese hamlets.
Yeah, Vietnamese hamlets because the Viet Cong would rely on local labor, right? They would look on people for taxation, for food, for information, for whatever. So even if these, villages or these hamlet goers, however they felt about the communists, maybe they supported them, maybe they did. The fact is, as long as they are there, they're going to help the enemy. So in some cases, they relocated entire hamlets. Now you can imagine that's very upsetting to the people who live there, right? And the places where they went to were not always great, but these were part of the ideas used to try to chip away at VC
and did
support.
That feed into the North Vietnamese Viet Cong
Well, the
propaganda?
communists, of course, made a lot of hay about that. That this was again, sort of crime against the Vietnamese people. Again, it's hard to tell of all the people they relocated, how many of them again actually were like, phew, I'm glad I'm out of there. It's safer here, and how many of them like, well, gosh, my brother is actually the local VC district chief. Hard to say, but it was. I mean, at this point, the war is increasing in such ferocity that it is actually affecting a lot of the people in the countryside who probably just wish they'd be left alone.
Yeah. And then, so this is Operation Cedar Falls, but then we also have Operation Junction City going on.
Which is an even bigger one, and that's up towards the Cambodian border, this big, massive wilderness called War Zone C, or that we called War Zone C. And again, converging from multiple directions. It's notable, among other things, for being the only major combat parachute jump of the war.
And who did that?
173rd Airborne Brigade. They're basically a battalion jump close to the border. It wasn't that they had to do it. I mean, there were other ways to get there, but part of Westmoreland's motivation was he wanted to put the communists on notice that if the time came that he got the authority, for example, to go into Cambodia, where a lot of these Viet Cong bases were, he could also do it with parachute troops. So that was the idea of that combat jump.
Oh, interesting. And then what was the purpose of the mission?
Again,
was it
War
a
Zone
logistics base they were going
massive
against?
area with all these hidden supply caches, enemy infiltration routes. It's huge piece of real estate, but the idea is to go in there and try to find them and destroy them. Because, as I said before, killing the enemy is only one among many ways to achieve victory. You can take away his food, you can take away his medicine, you can take away his ammunition, you can try to convince him to defect. That was a big part of the war, a psychological operation. So there's a lot of ways that you can achieve your objective.
How long did it last, and what was the result
That
of it?
that was an operation that lasted 5 or 6 weeks. While it was going, and again they're doing this in January and February because in South Vietnam they are under the influence of monsoon weather. So for half of the year, from like October to April in that area, it's pretty dry because of the monsoon winds.
Okay.
So these places are pretty dry, and you can actually put tanks and vehicles out there and operate. Now, when the rains come for the rest of the year, those places are much harder to operate in. So this is why they're doing it at that point. And again, you need American equipment. You need the big bulldozers. You need to be able to have not just Hueys, but even bigger helicopters like the CH-47 Chinooks, which we are still using.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
some of those
absolutely.
airframes are still in service. So again, it's because of these advantages that we could operate over such distances.
And then just talk a little bit about the tactics on the ground. Was it search and destroy, cordon and search? What were they doing?
In this particular case, when you only have a vague notion where the enemy is, and it could be, for example, they might use a plane flying overhead with infrared sensors, and the infrared sensors detect the campfires of an enemy camp. Right. That's one way. Or they, again, have an informant who says, hey, look here. Or you have
the LRPs?
The LRPs who actually go in, have eyes on, or air cavalry squadrons. U.S. commanders could never get enough air cavalry squadrons. So these are dedicated units based on helicopters, both the Huey gunships and a smaller aircraft. We use a Descendant today, OH-58, OH-600. It's a Cayuse. It's a two-person fast helicopter. So you're zipping around the terrain actually looking for signs of the enemy. And so by all these different techniques, once you get a fix, then you sort of pile on. But if you're on the ground as an infantry, it's a daunting prospect because this part of the country, triple canopy jungle, there are places where you do not see the light of day.
Yeah.
It is so thick, and you can only see, a few feet in front of you.
So you need that human intelligence.
You need human intelligence. You also need to make sure that you know where everyone else is, so you're not shooting your own people. Right. And also think about the U.S. air power. Great to have, but if your own airplanes don't know where you are, that's a problem. So M16s, this is actually one of the areas where there was some criticism, right? So the M16 rifle that came into service, the first year of operation, they realized it had some issues. One of it was the fact it would jam.
Okay.
Because the powder they used was wasn't very clean, and the soldiers weren't doing a really good job cleaning their weapons. Also, the spring was too tight. So the 21 magazine, you could only put 18 bullets in there.
Oh, wow.
If you put more than that, it would jam. So they did come up with improved versions, but it shot a light bullet, a 5.56 bullet. Like it's a 22 caliber. Yeah. And some of the soldiers complained that in all the foliage, you know what I'm saying, the actual banana leaves would kind of make the bullets go sideways. Right. Wow. Now, some of the American machine gunners are using heavier weapons, but the enemy's using heavier bullets.
Yeah, and they're using primarily what, the enemies? AK or 47?
AK version type, usually made in China, actually, but it's a 7.62.
Okay.
It's like a 30 caliber bullet. It's heavier.
And our M60 was a 7.2.
It was a 7.6, exactly. Yeah. And that could do a whole lot of damage, and that could punch through.
Right.
But there was, again, in certain environments, some of the soldiers were like, gosh, I really wish I had my M14.
Wow. Well, and, really? So they preferred that. But by this cases, time, with the M14s gone from the Army inventory?
They were disappearing. Some snipers still used them. A few...
I think Marines used them, too, didn't
Marines, they? They got their M16s a little later.
Okay.
All in all, though, especially once they fixed some of the M16 main problems, I would say if you did a survey, the vast majority of the troops actually said, yeah, the M16 is a better weapon. It's lighter, carry more ammo. If you clean it properly, it works just fine. And the M4 we have today is a descendant.
Oh yeah, of course.
Of the M16.
It is, right.
So, yeah.
And then, well, since we're talking about some weapons, we've talked about the M16, the M60 machine gun, but then they also had grenade launchers, the M79.
Yeah, the M79, which is they call the bloop gun, and it looks like it's like a sawed-off shotgun.
Yeah,
and it fired a single 40 millimeter grenade round. And for those of you, probably a lot of you, seen the movie Apocalypse Now, that famous scene by the bridge later on. And there's someone out there screaming in the jungle, and this one guy, he's got an M79, and he just kind of angles it up, boop, and gets them. It could fire buckshot, it could fire illumination, it could fire white phosphor. It's a very versatile weapon, but what ended up happening in Vietnam is they ended up going to a underslung grenade launcher beneath the M16.
So that happened during
the
M203,
M203, right? They began to experiment, and that has now kind of become the standard. But back then, the M79 definitely had its place in the arsenal. I mean, of course, bigger equipment. I mean, you had 50 caliber machine guns going back to World War I. We're still using those.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes when you get something right, it works forever.
Check.
M48 tanks. The patents, again, turned out to be very, very effective. M113 armored personnel carriers could actually bust through jungle.
Oh, wow.
So you had to be worried about the fire ants.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're going through the jungle and you hit a nest of wasp or fire ants and suddenly they're inside the compartment.
Wow.
So usually you'll see the big cans of bug spray on these vehicles when you see them.
Oh, amazing. And then what about the artillery at the time? How effective was the artillery?
Artillery, again, it was updated versions, World War II equipment, but the 105 millimeter howitzer
M101, I think it was.
Yeah, the M101 was a standard. Basically, every infantry battalion had this, battery in direct support. And then you had, at higher echelons, bigger weapons like the 155 howitzer. Right. Usually under brigade, division, corps support, up to the really big boys like the 8-inch and the 203 millimeter cannon, which could range out to 17, 18 miles.
Yeah. And then units had mortars, whether it was a
they
60
had mortars,
millimeter, 81.
60 millimeter, 81, and then the 4 deuce.
4 deuce,
which
millimeter.
is like about 120 millimeter. It started out as mainly being used for chemical, for sending smoke, but they also has a warhead. Now it's way too heavy for
that was
infantry to carry, but in a rare area. And then you had some other exotic weapons. You had recoilless rifles, of various.
And who would use those?
Depending, usually the heavy weapons company or platoon, and if you thought you needed it because it's kind of heavy. Usually, what they'd put it on a Jeep or something, or leave it back at base, or some like they're the quad 50s. Oh. Every Vietnam veteran will tell you about it. These are 450 caliber machine guns designed to be an anti-aircraft weapon, but in Vietnam, they use them for base defense.
Okay. Oh yeah, makes sense.
Well,
let's we'll talk more about maybe in the next episode a little bit more about other branches that we've got there.
Right.
But because I really want to get into talk about the Tet Offensive.
Yeah.
But the lead up to the Tet Offensive. So let's talk a little bit about that. I guess from both the enemy and the American Army.
From both sides.
Yeah.
So again, as I said in 1967, the war is expanding in intensity. More American troops are coming in. The enemy is pouring in more troops. The U.S. Scope of activity is growing. By mid-67, there's now parts of the 9th Infantry Division in the Mekong Delta, operating with the Navy Task Force doing amphibious operations. That's the first time we have, combat troops down there. The Army also created a provisional division in Southern I Corps by taking several brigades and lopping them together. So now the Army's pretty much everywhere. So we're reaching point of peak intensity. The enemy leaders in Hanoi know this. Our strength is moving towards 500,000 American troops, right? The communists are beginning to lose some ground. They're beginning to lose control over some of the countryside. And so they make a decision, let's strike a blow to win back momentum. But we know we can't strike the Americans because they're too powerful. What do? So they make a decision, we are going to try to basically do a surgical strike against the South Vietnamese government. They see that as the weak element.
Mm-hmm.
So the plan they come up with is basically this. At the New Year's of 1968, they're going to send the best forces they have, VC and NVA, to attack hundreds of South Vietnamese cities simultaneously, including Saigon.
And you mentioned that their New Year. They call that Tet.
They call that Tet because in Asia, they observe a lunar New Year cycle. Mm-hmm. So for us, it's a solar cycle. It's always 1 January.
Right.
But on a lunar cycle, it depends on the year. And this year, the Tet celebration, the holiday, falls right at the end of January 1968.
Yeah. Was it 30 January, I think?
The 31 January. Yeah. And the reason the communists chose that as their attack date is Tet is the biggest holiday in Vietnam. It's a holiday for being with family. And a lot of South Vietnamese soldiers were going to be on leave.
Oh, wow. So
this is the time you strike when their enemy is the weakest. So that's the general plan. So while these communist soldiers pour into the cities, the second part of it that they think is happening is a general uprising, right? Their agents in the cities are going to mobilize the masses who they think, hate the South Vietnamese government. The point of all this is if everything goes according to plan in a matter of days or weeks, the South Vietnamese government could collapse. And then the communists say, look, we'll take it from here.
Oh, wow.
We'll form a coalition government.
Mm-hmm.
Thank America, but don't need you anymore.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Tet offensive plan that the communists come up with.
And then, now let's talk about what really is one of the most well-known and largest campaigns of the war.
Yeah.
The Tet Offensive. So talk us through that. So we understand what their plan was, what they were going to target.
Right.
So what happened?
So the question, of course, is what did the Allies know? What did the Americans know? How much did they know about this ahead of time? Because this was months and months and months in preparation. So the short answer is we knew some things, but we never quite pieced the whole thing together. Mm-hmm. Partly because if on the face of it, it seems insane, right? The communists had spent the past several years avoiding costly battles where they couldn't control their own casualties. Yeah. So the idea that they're going to suddenly charge into the cities and expose themselves just seemed nuts. And the idea that the people are going to rise up, that didn't track. So a lot of American officers who tracked intelligence were seeing some signs of something. They're like, yeah, that can't be it though, because that doesn't make any sense.
Wow.
So in some places, the signs were stronger. Up near the DMZ, it seemed more likely. The North Vietnamese laid siege to this Marine base called Quai Son. A couple other places in the Highlands. But the bottom line is American intelligence just didn't piece the whole thing together. And the other big reason is this. In order to make this secret, most of the communists didn't know this was coming.
Oh, wow.
So only a few senior leaders in Hanoi and at the different front commands in the South actually knew the plan. The average rank and file communist soldier had no idea this was coming until like 24 hours ahead of time. So that's when they were told, oh, by the way, we are now going to attack this. And half the time, they didn't even know the city that they were entering.
Oh, interesting.
So it created a lot of operational secrecy, but it also created chaos when this thing happened. And
for the
communists,
the communists, right? Oh,
right. And this is probably, I think, one of the funniest stories. Well, it isn't funny in retrospect, but there was so much secrecy, in fact, that when Hanoi actually sent the orders saying when this thing was going to happen, they were a little vague. They said it's going to happen between the first and second nights of Tet. And it was only like a day later, like 36 hours before the attack began, they realized, oh my gosh, they're using a different calendar in South Vietnam. It was one day off.
Oh,
so when they said first and second days of Tet, the people in the South thought, oh, that meant the night of 29/30, not 30/31. So they had to send like, no, we actually mean blah, blah. So this is why in some parts of South Vietnam, some of the enemy troops attack one day early.
Oh.
And this actually gives the Allies some valuable advance warning. So when the big attack happens, 30/31 January across the country, the Allies are able to make some adjustments. But it is a firestorm. I mean, it hits all the major cities in South Vietnam.
Well, they hit the U.S. Embassy, too, didn't
Hit the
they?
U.S. Embassy, although funny, of all the targets, there were 10 targets in Saigon that the Viet Cong really commandos wanted to attack. They added the U.S. Embassy just a few days before the attack, almost as an afterthought.
Right, because you said that the plan was
was to take out the South Vietnamese.
Right, not to
No,
attack
I mean,
the
the Americans, look, they were happy to embarrass us, but the reason they added it was because they thought it would. They didn't actually think that they were going to take over the embassy. What they were going to do is take the grounds of the embassy, like the actual park outside the building, and then have a bunch of students from the university come stage a sit-down strike. So this was just part of the idea of creating sort of a public relations impression that it was a popular uprising. Now, it didn't happen that way, but that was the idea.
Right, and was this mostly Viet Cong, or was the North Vietnamese army involved?
This, for the Tet Offensive, it was half and half. Of the 84,000 communist soldiers in the initial wave, about half were North Vietnamese and about half were Viet Cong.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So then how did the U.S. Army respond to this?
So again, in the opening hours, lots of confusion. Some U.S. commanders had taken preparation because they thought, look, I've seen enough intelligence to think something's going to happen. In other cases, came as a surprise. But basically, within a few hours, the Americans, mobilized their forces, coordinated with the South Vietnamese, and began counterattacking. So within 24 hours, it went from, oh my gosh, this is the Alamo to, okay, Roger.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
this is bad, but we are now on the attack, and so that's generally the situation throughout most of the country. In the first few days, the Allies retake all the cities that the communists have penetrated. The exception being the city of Hue.
And that's up north, is it?
Up north in I Corps. It's the third largest city in South Vietnam. It was the old home of the Nguyen emperors in the 19th century. It's this massive stone fortress. And the several North Vietnamese battalions got inside that fortress and took over most of it.
Oh, wow.
And so that battle went on for about a month.
And was that with the Army or?
Army, Marines. The Marines, U.S. Marines, did most of the fighting in the city, the southern part of the city, and then in the Citadel, along with the South Vietnamese. Whereas the Army, the 1st Cavalry Division, or part of it, fought this battle off to the west to try to cut the supply line that the enemy was using into the mountains. So there was this whole other battle going on that isn't as well known, but was incredibly fierce. And like Ronnie Joe Hooper from the 101st receives the Medal of Honor for his heroics at a place called Ton La Chu.
And then at the same time, what was going on at Khe Sanh?
So Khe Sanh actually was one of the very few quiet places on the first day of Tet.
And where is that located?
And it is in the northwestern corner of Quang Tri province. So if you think of where South Vietnam meets North Vietnam, and that corner over by Laos, it's It's up in that corner of South.
wow.
It's a very remote location. There are about 6,000 Marines there and some South Vietnamese, and they were surrounded by 2 NVA divisions. So for a while, it was looking. It was concerning, let us say, to President Johnson, to the point where, in fact, General Westmoreland even just very quietly did a little study on the use of nuclear weapons.
Oh, wow.
I don't think he ever thought they would be needed, but he thought, due diligence. Of course, everyone is thinking about Dien Bien Phu, right? Where the French got defeated in 1954. There, is this another one? Well, no, it wasn't, because the Americans had all these advantages. But on the day of Tet, it's actually quiet because an American bomber had knocked out the NVA command post a week earlier. Oh. We didn't know at the time.
Yeah,
but that was. But on the 7th of February, for the first time in the war, North Vietnamese light tanks overran the Lang Vi Special Forces camp, which was just south of Khe Sanh. So this is the first time that they're actually using Soviet-designed light tanks. So they take over Lang Vi, but they never do take Khe Sanh. And in fact, once Tet settles down, 1st Cavalry Division helps lift the siege with Operation Pegasus.
Because they're in Wei.
They're up in I Corps.
After Wei is over, they move over to help the Marines at Khe Sanh.
And Westmoreland deliberately wanted the 1st Cavalry Division up in I Corps because he had plans for them to do to really just roam around and knock the North Vietnamese, wherever they could find them. In fact, he had a secret plan called El Paso, where he planned to take the 1st Cavalry Division and launch it into Laos in the later summer of '68 to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Oh.
So, this was part of his thinking. He never got permission, but that's why the 1st Cav was there.
And so how long before Khe Sanh was
in April of '68, basically, early April of '68, Pegasus effectively lifts the siege. Now, again, the Marines were there, see it a little differently. Yeah. They're like, look, we could have held out forever, and I think they're probably right. But the fact is, drove off a lot of the North Vietnamese who were in the surrounding hills. Ultimately, Americans end up basically abandoning Khe Sanh a few months later because it no longer serves the purpose for which we had it. That was going to be the jump-off point for that invasion of the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Oh, okay.
Right. And when the raiding season comes, it's like, we do go back there later, but that's why we lift the siege and then end up leaving.
So what I want to talk about then is the perception.
Yeah.
All right. So it sounds like you would define the Tet Offensive as was it a tactical, a strategic success for the United States, a failure for the communists? How would you describe it?
Yeah, there's certainly an argument to be made on both sides, but in a nutshell, I would say, from a tactical operational point of view, the Tet Offensive absolutely was a defeat for the communists. Of the 120 some odd thousand they committed during the whole thing, as many as 40,000 were killed or incapacitated. Wow. So they took enormous losses.
And the VC,
as a part of that,
they were. I've read in different places that the VC was basically destroyed as an effective.
Yeah, actually,
group.
And that's a misperception. There were certain VC units that were certainly pulverized during Tet, but in every single one of those cases, they're reconstituted. Like there's a battalion that gets almost totally annihilated in Tet, reconstituted, comes back and invades Saigon in May. So the fact is, the VC still remain an absolutely potent force. It's really other factors that are going on that explains that. But yeah, it was a pretty much balanced NVA VC losses.
But in some ways, then it's a tactical advantage for the United States at the end of this. But
Having said that,
right. So the media,
right,
was there reporting on this,
yeah,
and so it completely changes perception in the United States.
yeah. I mean, okay, that's that's certainly an argument that is often made. Okay, and this is how I would put it. It's a different tack. President Johnson in later '67, right, is telling the American people we're making progress in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
We've been fighting for a couple of years. We are actually seeing gains, and so he's setting the public up to expect more success, right? So when Tet happens and it takes the American public by surprise, of course,
just like it took the military by surprise.
To some extent, military surprise. Of course, the first reaction is like, "What the heck is going on here?" You know, you got images of dead sappers in the U.S. Embassy and that kind of thing. Cities on fire, but if you actually look at public opinion in those first few weeks after Tet, support for the president in the war actually goes up, not down.
Okay.
People don't turn against. People rally around the flag, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they may be
No,
confused,
very good point. Right,
but they actually rally around the flag. It isn't until 5-6 weeks later that the sort of public opinion starts dipping again. Part of the reason is after things settle down, it's clear that it's been defeated. General Westmoreland reintroduces an idea that he had pitched a year earlier. He said, really, to get this thing done, we may need to call up another 200,000 troops. Now, again, it wasn't just his idea. His superiors were kind of whispering in his ear, saying, "Look, our cupboards are almost bare." But politically, dead issue, right? Because to do that, you'd have to mobilize reserves, the National Guard. The anti-war movement was already very active, and so what happens is it's not that the media gave a wrong impression of Tet. It's not the media turned the public against it. I think looking at all the coverage, the media is pretty down the middle. But the fact is, and this is where I refer back to Walter Cronkite. The great CBS news anchor.
Right.
This is a guy who flew B-17 missions in World War II. I mean, not a wallflower, not a pacifist.
Right.
So when he goes on in late February and gives a short little editorial, what he basically says is, and he was there, he went away and saw it for himself. He said, "Look, I think it's unrealistic to say that America is near defeat. It's not true. We are nowhere near defeat. We can keep fighting this war, as long as we feel like it. However, I also don't see how we can bring the war to a successful conclusion in any reasonable time or cost." And so he says, basically, what I see is a stalemate. I think he was exactly right. I think that's the key.
All right.
Is the shock of Tet, seeing that this war was not on its downward slope. That's when a lot of people said,
right,
okay, how long will this need to go on?
Right. And so we need to pivot from Tet because really immediately after that, or still while some of that was going on, another dark day took place in Army history. And, we know that as the My Lai Massacre.
Right.
So March 16th, 1968. So if you can just describe what happened that day.
In a lot of ways, this is an outgrowth of Tet. Okay. One of the big priorities in 1967 was helping the South Vietnamese with this thing called pacification, which was basically to root out all these Viet Cong agents in the villages to get the people to support the government. Southern I Corps was one of the hardest places to do this because the Viet Cong support went back decades. Okay. So this one province, Quang Ngai province, right? You had a new American division called the Americal, or the 23rd, and several of its battalions went on the special operation in March. Their purpose was to sort of win back territory that had been lost during Tet. What happens, unfortunately, is that some of those American troops, particularly ones led by Captain Medina and Lieutenant Calley, go into this one of several villages known as My Lai and basically begin massacring the civilians. In some cases, sexually assaulting them, desecrating. I mean, it's awful. There's no way around it. A loss of morale, discipline, gets out of
Definitely
control.
a breakdown in leadership.
Breakdown in leadership.
Yeah.
Now, again, not everybody in the America in that area was doing it, but there were certain platoons and one or two companies where this was happening. Now, there were a few shining heroes of the moment. You know, Hugh Thompson, for example, was a helicopter pilot flying overhead. He had two people in his helicopter. Flying over, he saw American soldiers doing this. He landed his helicopter, got out with the .45 and aimed it at. He said, "You will stop." Right. Wow. So he was obviously disturbed. He went back home, reported it. Some other people did. The offshoot is there was an investigation done by the division on what happened, and it was kind of a whitewash. They basically said, well, a lot of those people were probably killed by artillery, or it could have been this, could have been that. So this initial investigation kind of got, so for the rest of 68 and well into 69, the American public does not know about this.
Wow. Yeah.
But people who are there are still talking about it. Okay. So, and this is something we will be dealing with in the next episode, the fallout, but this does happen on the heels of Tet.
Yeah. And, and the lessons learned from this, and I think we'll address in the next episode.
Right.
But there are some very positive after effects.
Right. I mean, it is absolutely one of the blackest episodes in Army history. No question. No, dodging that at all.
No.
But
and we have to acknowledge that.
We have to acknowledge it. Absolutely. But in the longer run, the lessons that the Army did learn from it and applied have, I think, served us well in the years since. Again, and this is not to take away from any of the anguish of the Vietnamese or any of that. It's just to say that, we have to look it square in the face and understand why it happened and make sure it never does again.
But and as a professional institution, which the United States Army is, something as terrible as this happens, and we make changes.
Right.
That from that time period on, that ethics training. I think you talked about earlier, rules of engagement.
Oh, yeah, rules of engagement.
All of these things.
Embedding JAGs, Judge Advocate Generals at multiple echelons so that you have someone looking over the commander's shoulder, making sure that everything is looking right. I mean, this is the Army we have now, and it's because of My Lai.
Yeah, and great. Well, thank you for those insights. Eric, is there anything else about 1968 that you want to wrap up with? Well,
I would just say that after again Tet Offensive and all this confusion and questioning, the next 6 months, there's some changes. President Johnson, announces on TV that he will not run for re-election. He's going to devote himself to trying to bring peace. He'd actually made the decision not to run months earlier, but he announces it there. General Westmoreland becomes Army Chief of Staff and gives way to his deputy, Creighton Abrams.
When is that? When does he take over?
Effectively May, June 68. So Abrams, who got there in April 67 to work with the South Vietnamese, he becomes the new MACD commander. The communists launch a second general offensive in May and June. Not as big as Tet. It's sometimes all mini Tet, although pretty devastating in Saigon. And they launch a third one in August and September. So the takeaway there is the leaders in Hanoi are still dedicated. They didn't get the result they wanted. Right. It wasn't a knockout blow. But on the whole, these are professional revolutionaries ideologically committed to this. They want to sort of keep the pain going. So this is this period is the most intense period of the war. And in fact, the first week of the Tet Offensive is the highest number of American combat fatalities in the entire Cold War. That is the hottest point of the Cold War.
And when you mentioned keeping the pain going, they fully understand, the communists, that is, the perception. Yeah, and taking the war, if you will, to the American people.
Right. I mean, the American public opinion was never a first priority in their thinking. Again, they always had that as a component, but they were always looking for ways to generate leverage on the battlefield. And as 68 wears on, what they're mostly trying to do is trying to create sort of a fracture point more and more between the Americans and the South Vietnamese, because everyone involved is beginning to understand this war cannot be won decisively. It has to be won at the negotiating table. So that is the other big development. In the summer of 68, both sides agreed to begin peace talks. Now, they don't actually begin in earnest, but they say we'll meet in Paris and we will start to...
So that's the beginning of the Paris peace talks.
Yeah, then. and so this is where there's a shift in the war, and so the fighting now becomes a part of diplomacy.
All right, well, Eric, before we close, it's time again for our segment called Hua Trivia.
Hua Trivia.
So this piece of significant Army trivia that hoping we will wow the audience. So
no pressure there. Right?
Is there some piece of Army trivia, Hua Trivia, that you can share in this stage of the Vietnam War?
Well, again, Tet Offensive is, of course, one of my favorite topics. But I gotta say, I'm going to pivot a little on this and mention something that we didn't really talk about in our discussion, the Battle of Dak To. This is in the Central Highlands in November 67. And we've talked about the 173rd Airborne, right? This very famous fight, Hill 875, where the 173rd is attacking up this hill day after day against entrenched positions. And at one point, they're surrounded, call in air support, and a Marine A4 drops 2 bombs. One of it lands right in the middle of the American perimeter. And one of the Medal of Honor winners is the chaplain, right? Rodgers, who is there with the soldiers. And so I just kind of want to, you and I went to Fort Jackson, like saw the chaplain school, and just to acknowledge that it isn't just the trigger pullers. I mean, it's the chaplains and the other folks who are out there too, and the photographers. And
I mean, in these kinds of wars, there's no real front lines.
No,
everyone is so a tip of the hat to the chaplains and to the Battle of Dak To too, which is important.
Yeah.
All right, Eric. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate your insights again and discussion today about 1967, 1968. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Vietnam War or Army history in general, I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil, where you can access all of our publications about Vietnam. They're available as free PDF downloads, or you can purchase them from the Government Publishing Office. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please join us every week on this podcast for more in-depth discussions about Army history as we cover topics from all eras of U.S. Army history, examining battles, soldier experiences, equipment, weapons, tactics, and lots of Hua Trivia. Thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds. And until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.